As explained in a previous video, the first modern historian was Leopold von Ranke, and he was an empiricist, which means he believed that knowledge came from observing an experience. I saw it, therefore it happened. This is why he split the sources into two camps. Those that directly observed the events of history he called primary sources, and those which didn't observe the events directly, those which recorded them second or third hand, would be classed as secondary sources. However, this primary and secondary source distinction has been interpreted by people to mean that all primary sources are better than secondary sources. And indeed, that's how Ranke saw it too. But is this really the case? And the answer is no. As crazy as it may sound, the primary sources are often worse than many of the secondary sources, and there are a few reasons for why this is the case. So let me show you what I mean. Here is a timescale running from the event in the past to the present day. If I said to you, I have an ancient Roman sword, you would expect that ancient Roman sword to have been made circa 2000 years ago, at the time of ancient Rome. If I then said, no, I forged it yesterday in my shed, then it obviously wouldn't be an authentic ancient Roman sword. It would be a copy, and it wouldn't be a genuine artifact from the past. And if I then claimed it was a genuine artifact from the past, you would be right to call it a forgery. So the lesson here is that primary sources must come from the time of the event. Artifacts, castles, video evidence, these things should come from the event itself. It doesn't make sense for these things to come from some time after the event, because then they would be forgeries. Well, the same thing applies to written records. Ideally, you want a diary written on the day or the day after, or as close to the event as possible, so that the memories are fresh in the minds of those who witness the event. Stenographic records should be recorded immediately as the speaker is speaking, and other records would also need to be as close to the event as possible. So, primary sources are most useful when they are recorded close to the event of the past. But what about other types of primary sources? What about memoirs? When are memoirs usually written? Not at the time of the event. They're usually written 20 years later. Well, memories fade. When I look back over my diary that I wrote during the lockdowns, I had forgotten several things and misremembered other events. Human memory is not perfect. Interviews conducted with witnesses at the time of the event are way more useful than interviews conducted 20 years later for the same reason. And so, primary sources are only really useful if the memory of the event is fresh in the minds of those recording them. Now let's think of secondary sources. Historians gather all the primary sources they can, then try to validate their conclusions via logic. Sometimes mistakes are made, or contradictions exist within the primary and secondary sources, so it can take time to discover or uncover new evidence, wade through the debates surrounding the contradictions and interpretations, and so on. So it is actually the passage of time that makes secondary sources more useful. You actually want secondary sources written as close to the present time as possible, because they're more likely to have more evidence and more likely to have overcome previous mistakes, contradictions, and biases. However, this isn't to say that histories written years ago are not useful. Yes, they are still valid and they still should be used, but they are not as useful as histories written more recently. And this brings us to newspapers and journalists. While they might record what eyewitnesses saw, and these are usually immediately after the event, so that is good, the journalists themselves most likely didn't witness the event, or if they did, they're biased, and so these are classed as secondary sources. Yet they are interpreting the event and making conclusions about the event in the immediate aftermath of the event. That means they're going to be making mistakes. Their conclusions are not going to be accurate. They've not had time to gather all the primary sources or wade through all the contradictions and debates because it's not possible for them to do that in that short space of time. Thus, in terms of the interpretation and conclusions they're coming to, newspapers and journalists are the least useful of the secondary sources. There's a slight chance that they accidentally stumble into the correct conclusion, but usually they don't, and this is where the fake news and don't trust the media slogans come from. And these memes are correct. The media is not trustworthy in the slightest for this reason, as well as the fact that they're in the pockets of the politicians and the ideologues. But they are still valid sources and cannot just be dismissed. They are also valuable if they are interviewing eyewitnesses and similar things like that. So there is a place for newspapers and journalists within history, but they are some of the worst sources of information and definitely cannot be taken at face value. You absolutely have to be questioning anything you read in the newspapers. And I just want to make this clear as well. Unless it is an invalid source, like a forgery, you cannot dismiss a source just because you don't like it. To overcome the biases and contradictions, you have to use all the valid sources that you can. So dismissing sources just purely because you don't like them is a distortion of history. You can explain why a source is wrong, but you still have to use it. However, there are invalid sources. In terms of primary sources, these tend to be forgeries or outright fabrications. For secondary sources, you see historians who are relying on belief rather than evidence, or personal opinion not backed by sources, or very few, or just people dismissing sources. These traits and others invalidate these sources. With this in mind, and with the understanding that you want your primary sources recorded as close to the event as possible, and that you want your secondary sources written as close to the present time as possible, we can now arrange the sources into tiers, going from A, the most useful, to E, the least useful, with F being sources that should be discarded. In the F tier go the forgeries and fabrications, etc. And I've added a few more here. People practicing Cartesian doubt, the belief that you can never be right, so you may as well make stuff up. Slanderers, smearers, and liars, because we're aiming to get to the truth and none of these are truthful, so it's a self-refutation. Whataboutists, people who can't accept that they're wrong, so they'll change the subject to something barely related to avoid having to admit the truth. People who don't believe in reality, also known as the dialectical materialists. Subjectivists, because they're using the wrong method of history. Feelings and beliefs are not logical validations of your conclusions based on the evidence. Postmodernists, again, people who believe they can make stuff up. People who believe in magic blood or spirits or doppelganger Hess, right? All of this is nonsense. None of this is reality. None of this is real history. You're doing fiction. And so you can squarely go in the F tier and really should be discarded. Sources like this are the only truly invalid sources. Now, when I showed this tier list in a previous video, somebody complained about this F tier, claiming that I've contradicted myself, and then proceeded to defend forgeries using Cartesian doubt and another bunch of nonsense tactics. Normally, I would just ignore such insanity. But I was genuinely shocked to hear somebody so adamant in defending lies and liars that I just had to warn everyone that not everyone doing history is aiming for the truth. Some are aiming to distort history in order to maintain their false beliefs. So I won't waste your time here going through his criticism, but if you're curious, I have written up a response to this person, and you can find the link to that response in the description. But for now, let's continue with the tier list. And this is going to shock a lot of people, but the worst valid sources, the least useful, are memoirs. They go squarely in the E tier for all the reasons I explained before. Many people start their journey into history by looking into memoirs, mistakenly thinking these are trustworthy sources. But memoirs are not trustworthy. Too many agendas, too many biases, too many years have passed to allow these authors to distort history. I've called out Manstein and Guderian numerous times on this channel, and many historians have too, because they've lied through their teeth. So memoirs are some of the worst of the valid sources available. But they're not the only ones. Alongside memoirs in the E tier are interviews conducted with eyewitnesses many years after the event. Just like memoirs, too much time has passed for memories to fade and agendas to be inserted. So you've got to be careful when using these as sources. I would say that these are slightly better than memoirs because the interviewer could challenge the interviewee, and from that we could get an admission of guilt or possibly new information. But in general, You want to avoid these until you've looked at the other sources first. In the D tier go newspapers written by journalists immediately after the event. They're certainly not as bad as memoirs, but they are squarely in the D tier because of their misinterpretations and faulty conclusions. They can be useful due to the eyewitness testimony, and sometimes they can accidentally come to the correct interpretation, but they are still awful and it's generally best to not start with them. There's a great example in my upcoming Battlestorm Gazala documentary, where every single source says an event happened one way, but a newspaper at the time says it happened in another way. I won't spoil it, but it will highlight what I mean when I say newspapers are not great sources. In the C tier, we'll place the old history books, usually those written a few years or decades after the event, but still many years from the present day. These are going to be out of date through no fault of their own, and are likely to come to some correct conclusions, and some bad ones. Still valuable overall, but again, not a great starting place if you're wading into a topic, because agendas are probably awash in them due to the heavy reliance on the primary sources and just not having time to validate all the conclusions they're coming to. A good example is William Shirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which was published in 1960. It was one of the first books I read on the topic, which is why it's falling apart. And it's wrong. First, it's written by a communist, and they never lie. And it's ironic that this is also held up by the National Socialists as a good book, because Shirer says several times that he's just gone off the phone to Halder, and Halder said such and such. Well, it turns out that Halder was manipulating the sources, literally burning books in order to cover his tracks and whitewash the German army of its crimes. Shirer also pushes the idea that the Austrians were pressured to vote for the Anschluss and thus were a victim of Nazi Germany. This was shown to not be the case a year later by historian A.J.P. Taylor, and it turns out that the Austrians went willingly over to Germany. And as I showed in the previous video, Shirer also pushes the idea that Hitler was funded into power by the capitalists, a myth that was based on dubious memoirs and subsequently disproven in the 1980s by historian Henry Ashby Turner. So there are numerous flaws in Shirer's book, many of which would be overcome by future historians, and its main problem is that it's simply out of date. So this is why old history books are in the C tier. Alongside them, though, are primary sources recorded immediately after the event, things like diaries or interviews conducted the same day or the next day. Memories are fresh here, and while bias, agenda and other limitations exist, there hasn't been sufficient time for future agendas to corrupt the narrative. You still have to be very careful with them though, because liars do exist, as do people who want to manipulate you and make you think a certain way, so again, very valuable, just not a great starting place if you're wading into a topic. In the B tier are primary sources recording the event itself. Video footage, audio, stenographic records, things like that. These are still limited. You may not know why an event is taking place, multiple angles will be needed, and these primary sources cannot interpret themselves or come to conceptual conclusions. But they are still very useful for obvious reasons. Unlike a diary, these tend to convey a lot more information and are generally more accurate, but you've still got to be careful. Forgeries can exist, which may become a major problem in the immediate future thanks to AI and deepfakes, but still, these are definitely sources worthy of a B tier. And again, perhaps shocking to many, in the A tier go the most valuable historical sources, which are the histories written by historians that are as close to the present time as possible. I am not saying they are perfect, and I am not saying they're 100% right all the time. They're not. Bad histories do get written, agendas, misinterpretations, and contradictions do seep into the narratives. But, in general, these are by far the most valuable historical sources available because the more time that passes, the more we will have time to overcome the contradictions, agendas, biases, and so on of previous histories. When you are beginning your journey into a topic, this is where you want to begin. You want to start here, read several recent histories on the same topic, and then slowly work your way down the tiers. Professional historians should do this too, not just readers or students of history. Obviously, when a new event occurs, there won't be any secondary sources written by historians, so you have no choice but to start using the lesser sources, or avoid that topic altogether. But if possible, you want to use the most recent histories you can get your hands on, and you want to use as many as possible, so that you can identify any problems within one or more of them. Please use multiple sources. I cannot stress this enough. And if you are a professional historian, then you need to be using all the sources you can get your hands on. And there's a couple of things to note here. This is the exact opposite conclusion that the empiricists would come to. They said that direct observation of the experience was the best way to gain knowledge, but this is not true. What the empiricists forgot was that in order to get to the truth about history, you need to not just observe history, but to perceive it. In order to do that, you have to use all the sources, both primary and secondary, and you have to logically validate your conclusions. We can directly perceive the past through the records, and it's the most up-to-date secondary sources that allow us to do this the best. This isn't the subjectivist theory of history, but an objective theory of history. And once you understand that the emphasis should be placed on the logical validation of the conceptual conclusions based on a foundation of direct evidence, then the sources must be arranged in this order of usefulness. See my video, But How Do You Know You're Right, for a complete explanation of the objective theory of history. And I just want to emphasize this again. Not all sources are created equally. Just because something is classified in the A tier doesn't mean it's equal to another one in that tier, or that it's a good source. You could have two modern histories written at the same time, both classed as A tier sources, but in reality one is much better than the other. This tier list is only a broad classification for the general categories, not a review of each individual source within them. And to clarify, a genuine historian consciously validates his own knowledge of history by basing his conceptual conclusions on a foundation of logic and as much evidence as he can possibly gather. When he does this, then his history is valid. It may not be right, but it is valid. Again, I explained this new objective theory of history in my video, But How Do You Know You're Right? So check that out for a full explanation of that. And many were praising it as the best, if not most important video I've ever done. And I agree, it's definitely up there, even if YouTube didn't notify anybody of it. Thanks for watching, bye for now.